should be in the ellipsis, I think, up at the top.
Yeah.
There we go.
I think we are good to go, Jared.
Yep, looks like it.
Just should we start or wait?
Well, I can't tell if it's actually recording or
Yeah,
not.
it's recording, Ross, so you can go ahead and...
Okay, all right. Well, yeah, thanks, Jared. Tonight we have Chirag Shah with us, and he's going to be talking about setting up AlwaysOn availability groups in the Azure VM. So, Chirag, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Ross. Thanks, Jared, as well. So just brief what I'm going to talk about and brief about myself. My name is Chirag Shah. I am a customer engineer at Microsoft, 8 years. I see some familiar names here, Steve Clark. I see David Lobos. I think I might have met him as well, and so forth. So what I'm talking about here, let me share my screen. A little bit dry topic, completely understand. I like to talk about high availability features in SQL Server. We have talked to SQL Saturdays about availability groups as well. And I think I'm gonna not turn on the video, probably not important. So I'm just gonna see if we can focus. You can see my desktop, right? All good? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So we're gonna talk about availability groups in Azure. I expect everybody who are here to have familiarity with deploying availability groups on premises or in Azure, just knows high level on the SQL side of stuff. So if you're a very beginner, never deployed any availability groups, probably this session is not for you. And so forth, but you have some understanding what I'm gonna talk about at least, so that would be helpful. Again, just a disclaimer here: the content, ideas, opinions are my own, okay, not my employer. And then the agenda here, I'm gonna start with some of your experience deploying availability groups. It's very popular feature in terms of high availability for the SQL Server, whether you run on premises or using a box product in Azure on an Azure VM, right? It's the same, basically the SQL product that you deploy on premises, you deploy it on the Azure VM and so forth. So just going to talk about just the high level best practices for the virtual machines, the Azure virtual machines running the availability groups, slightly different than what you generally tend to see on premises. Secondly is, I think the most part, the availability group setup is very similar how you do it in on premises. I'll just quickly walk you through the part, but then the only difference is listener setup, which require like a load balancer. And then I'll also talk about a new feature per se that we introduced in SQL Server 2019, part of a cumulative update, that you can leverage it in place of creating a listener. You're creating a different type of listener, which doesn't require a load balancer. And I think that technology can also be, if you want to use it on premises, you can, which we call distributed network name and so forth, which just like an alternative to use the traditional listener. It is a type of listener and so forth, and we'll talk about it as well and so forth. So in an overall, I had an hour. I have to basically decide what should I talk about AlwaysOn availability groups? Pretty sure most of you have used it, know about it, deployed it, and so forth. So I took it as a prerequisite. But load balancer, I think it's a very tricky. You may have so many permutations that we have seen customers who even do it multiple times, may have a different scenario all of a sudden and it doesn't work and so forth. So I'll talk about briefly, may have like a little demo on the distributed network name as well. And just want to give you that just high level perspective on this technology as well. So best practices for Windows virtual machines for high availability. Okay, so the cluster side of setup, if you run SQL Server on Azure virtual machines, what's different? I put it all the best practices into one slide. We'll talk about some of this, I'll expand it and so forth, but these are quite a few, right? So briefly speaking, let me just talk to the first one. When you deploy the Azure virtual machines, the best case scenario you would have is to use availability set and availability zones to provide additional resilience. And I'll touch upon what those are, but that is something you should do it for at least the critical servers, the production servers, something like that. Definitely recommended. We'll talk about what is availability set and availability zones. Second thing is for Windows failover clustering. See, traditionally for on-premise environment, we used to call, hey, at least public network, private network, multiple network paths between the cluster nodes and so forth. For Azure, because the infrastructure itself, the Azure fabric has so much redundancy into it, you only need one the adapter in the actual the cluster, the nodes that is participating in availability groups. If you try to do multiple, it creates the issue actually. So the single NIC per VM, that is another best practice. Another thing is relax the the cluster network threshold. These all things are documented in our best practices documentation, but it does says relax the cluster network threshold. And what it is basically, so we expect, in a cloud environment, there may be some, network latency along the night between the nodes. So we document and says, hey, relax it, double the whatever the default values and so forth. And I'll talk about more on later in the slide as well. And another thing, quorum. When you talk about cluster, why can't we talk about quorum? So absolutely, definitely, quorum is very vital. It is always desired to have a cluster quorum. And for a cloud environment, recommendation is to use, especially in the Azure virtual machines, we recommend use a cloud witness. Also, we recommend you take away the votes from the DR node and so forth. Now, this is very specific. The Azure virtual machine related configuration is to use a load balancer. And the load balancer is needed to support listener functionality. Here is a slight twist into it and so forth. If you deploy, and I'll show you all of this in an action as well in the portal and Azure portal and see how does this fits into it. But let me just run through this PowerPoint, which is maybe a little bit dry, but allow me. So in the cloud environment, if you set up, and I'll be talking even broadly, mostly apply to some sort of all public clouds. They do the same things slightly differently, maybe varies between different providers, but along that route, they need some extra mechanisms to set up a listener and so forth. So in Azure environment, you do need a load balancer. If you do a multi-subnet cluster, you will need when I say multi-subnet, you deployed the nodes, the virtual machines into a different region in Azure, say US East versus US West, for not only high availability, but disaster recovery. In that case, you will need the load balancer on the both sides, both regions. That is something you have to keep in mind. So you need like multiple load balancer depending upon how many regions your the nodes and the virtual machine spans and so forth. Just briefly, I'll talk about the ports needed. Also very important. If you use NSG or any other kind of firewall, on top of what we have it built into Windows, you probably won't need those ports open as well explicitly, especially for the SQL Server port. The port you use for the when I say DBM, database mirroring, which is actually the HADR endpoint, the availability group endpoint, defaults to 5022, but your configuration changes and so forth. And then I'll talk about a couple of few more things very specific when I touch upon the load balancer part, which I put it here. You may would need to have like the ports configure for each availability group slightly differently, the backend port and stuff like that. But that is just a high level list of all the good and best practices for setting up the virtual machines for this. I'll briefly touch upon the one I put it up here, and I'll just quickly run by some of this. So availability set is very important. What does it mean? Is basically the actual virtual machine, right? If the underlying host requires a firmware upgrade or some sort of a software upgrade, right? In that case, you want to make sure that you have an extra resiliency available and so forth. We're talking about say for example, you have a virtual machine deployed that is going to be your primary replica. When you set up an availability set, you kind of not only guarantee the upgrades like a patches at the host layer, so and so forth. So if the host is being patched, obviously all the virtual machines that runs. And now just one clarification here, unlike on premises, if you have a very strict on premises mindset where you have like like a either Hyper-V or VMware virtual machine, cloud has slightly different fabric. So it doesn't have a lot of what I call bare metal hypervisor and stuff like that, because those are not very scalable to the compute size that any cloud platform can. But it is a virtual machine which has some backbone of the host, but it is don't put it into context like it is similar as like a virtual machine running on a bare metal hypervisor or stuff like that. Slightly different. The fabric is different. How the resources get provisioned and managed is also way different than host and guest. But again, the topology still applies. So you have to be very mindful what happens if underlying host get patched or need some upgrades. You may have a hardware failure like a power supply or something. So when you put a VM into availability set, what we do actually is the VMs, actually there are two VMs behind the scene which actually get deployed in a different rack. So they have a different network cables, they have a different power supplies, and so that in a way that when underlying hosts get upgraded or maintenance work is done on the hardware part, the no both so not both the all the virtual machines that participate in the availability set, the work is done at the same time. Means if a patch is being applied, a firmware being applied, we don't apply it at the same time. So you have an extra resiliency, so they remain available. So increase something called and that's why they maintain the SLAs and so forth. So availability set is one area that you want to have it. So for production workload. Another thing is, say you deployed your virtual machines in an Azure data center, say North Central, which is I believe it's Chicago area and so forth. So you deployed your virtual machines. You may want to do something called availability zones, meaning within an Azure region, we may have data centers or the actual data centers that spans multiple buildings. It could be a few meters apart, right? The actual building where which house is. So what happens, like I deployed a virtual machine into an availability zone. That means it's going to be a set of machines. The one machine will be located in the building number 1, and the other machine would be located on building number 2. Now that building number 2 may be 1,000 feet apart from the building number 1, or maybe sometimes it is couple miles apart, depending upon how that data center has been developed and set up. Okay, so certain region in Azure, for example, Azure East 2, the buildings are actually 3 miles apart and so forth. But again, not to go into that level of details, but generally when you say availability zones, it means it's a set of VMs that basically gonna be only for you. It is going to be one SQL server that is running on as the virtual machine, right? But an additional resiliency, because if that building has something like a fire or something, you still are protected because there is another virtual machine that you can leverage it to maintain that. So an additional level of what I call it resiliency for sustainability, for kind of hardware failures or some sort of natural disaster and so forth. Now, um, uh, uh, talk about the quorum. Pretty interesting as usual. Cloud witness, you want to use it and so forth. See, on premises, if you deploy SQL Server or anywhere else, generally you require some sort of file share, right? In cloud environment, you can have file share, but you really don't want to use it. You know, those file share, because you're now kind of putting an extra complexity, having some sort of SMB file share in the cloud environment. Cloud environment is different. So need to do things differently. So what we have done in Windows clustering, even I believe it's starting with the Windows 2016, you can now leverage something called Cloud Witness, which I can show you here in the screen here, and so forth, and even in a practice here when I go to the VMs here. So pretty easy to set up. The deployment of Cloud Witness is built into the cluster manager user interface. So you can just do few clicks, but does require an Azure blob storage. The cost of running a Cloud Witness is minuscule. We don't write a lot to it. It does require like a blob storage to hold some metadata, but the cost of ownership per month is I would say in pennies, not even in dollars along that line. So it's pretty inexpensive and so forth. One more thing I'll touch upon here is a single NIC. So kind of raises an eyebrow and says just one NIC and so forth. But keep in mind, these are the virtual machine itself, even though it's shown as a one network adapter, the underlying physical infrastructure has resiliency and redundancy built into it, so that you don't need to do like NIC theming in a cloud environment. And I'll tell you that if you do multiple NICs, you are creating more complexity, more issues and stuff like that. So single NIC, even if the cluster validation will give you a warning that I'm shown here, right? Basically it says, hey, node 1 and node 2 are not reachable from only one pair of network. Fine, ignore it for this particular cloud environment and so forth. And then I talked about even sometime on premises, this probably applicable, relax the cluster network threshold. If you don't have a super good networks where nodes kind of loses the heartbeat and stuff like that. If you look at here, in this slide here, it's a very notorious issue we tend to see more and more, right? Always. So we call it 1135. So what happens in a clustering? The nodes talk to each other. We call it heartbeat, right? Loss of heartbeat causes issues with availability group and so forth, because if the nodes cannot talk to each other, you will see if some of you have experienced, you may see the availability group will go into a resolving state and stuff like that. So cloud environment, we kind of expect maybe there is some transient network issue. So what has been done, we also change windows. And if you look at the some stuff here in the right here, maybe I'm zooming in too much, but if you look at here, cross subnet threshold between version of Windows 2012 to 2016, we went from 5 to 20. Similarly, same subnet threshold, the operating system with version from 2008 R2 to, let's look at 2016, we double it, right? So we kind of relaxed it already, built into as a default out of the box setting and so forth. So something you want to keep in mind. And here is the slightly extra more details that I'm going to providing. So when you run Windows failover cluster nodes in Azure VM, yeah, you can run something like this, like a PowerShell command. And if you look at here, I relaxed it, the same subnet threshold to 20. So means and there's something called here called same subnet threshold, delay, and cross subnet delay and threshold. So what it means, delay is in milliseconds, so 1000 millisecond, one second. So every 1 second we check, and same subnet means node within the same subnet, means same regions. So if for 20 seconds we cannot communicate to the other node, yes, then the cluster and availability groups can take the necessary mitigation. But just a high level, we do recommend you relax this. So these are a few things. I don't know. I have anybody has any question on? I'm not paying attention to the chat here, so Jared, speak it up if there are any questions, or anybody has any questions on anything that I have talked about up until now.
Yeah, I have a question.
Go ahead.
What's the maximum distance that you can have between availability groups?
So good question. Actually, in theory, if in terms of, I'm assuming you're talking about the geographical distance and so forth, right? So
Correct.
In theory and in practice, there is no such limit exist, right? The example I have here, I have multiple examples here, but I'll just show you the screen here. So I have an availability group deployed here. This resource is, I think one is going to be in the north central, and the other node. So I have an AG node 1, just to show you. This is just a high level. I have a topology where I have 3 nodes in a cluster, availability group node 1. One of them is in the north central, and then I may have another node, just go back to in the back, which will be in the like a US East 2, which is I think 1500. Sorry, good old like 2000s or 3000 miles apart. But I'm not. I'm saying it doesn't have to be that. You can have even across the Atlantic Ocean. Possible, absolutely. So this is in East US 2 region. So uh, in theory and in practice, yes, the replica has to be asynchronous, but there is no geographical distance limit for the product itself. Okay, they can span any other region as long as the region supports the underlying SQL Server functionality and so forth.
And I think, just to clarify, Ross, you could, just because I looked at the chat, and you're talking about an availability zone, right? So different data centers within a region, right? So that's an availability zone. Is that what you're asking, Ross? You're on mute.
Yeah, looks like he's mute, but I think let me clarify. Availability zone is slightly different. So when you provision a virtual machine and say, right, you will be given, say I go to virtual machines, for example, I can say add, right? At that time, they will give you an option. Do you want to use? So it says availability options. For example, at that time, they will give you two options, availability set and availability zone, right? So depending upon, again, the skew of the VM and it changes. So if I have a higher skew, for if I do it, I may get options and so forth. And depending upon the region I'm doing it. So availability set, if I do availability set means I'm actually provisioning like a two virtual machines. There is an additional cost for it actually, but it's a one virtual machine, but provide me, I mean, when I say virtual machine is the underlying infrastructure has additional resiliency so that if there is a maintenance occur or something occurs, etc. But availability zone itself, so it's little bit even higher than the set. Set means within the data center. The machines would be on a different rack, different power supply, different network cables, stuff like that. But when you go to zone, we're basically saying that we're going to have multiple machines and they will be kind of supporting your virtual machine. They they are located in different building. Now, zones generally is not customer exposed. They don't decide, which building and where it is, but it's within the region, means within the same Azure, when I call data center, but different housed in a different the buildings or the underlying infrastructure. So they're protected from fire or flood or something like that along
So
that
they'd
line.
be in a different floodplain and a different power grid.
Yes, yes, that is true. So generally even the same building would have multiple power grid supply, so and so forth, but along that line. Any other question
I
from
have a
the?
question, Chirag. This is Amina. So I have a customer, just exactly same thing. So they have selected the availability zone, and whenever the underlying hardware gets updated by Microsoft, they get a failover. So they had the setting changed to 22 seconds because the last time, when they checked the log, that's how long take. But then sometimes, so when I came in as an advisory, so I recommended them to 40 seconds. So, but they took this advice, but they said, how we know for sure, is there no Microsoft recommendation? So I said, they cannot give one number for every client. It depends, right? So I just want to understand that I understand the availability set, but in availability zone, if the underlying hardware is having an upgrade, how it goes to the another VM, the main VM.
Okay, so Ramina, the way it works, let me answer your questions. I think just on the these are all what I talk about. Say it says IaaS with SQL Server always on. failover custom network thresholds. They actually show you cause resolutions. They talk about what basically I have it here. Not only that, it says change the same subnet to 20, right? So generally that is what it is. Go back to your question about availability zone and set. Ideally, you can have both basically, where you protecting the resource within the data center by having it on a separate rack, right? For the like a cabling and that perspective, and then providing an extra resiliency by housing them. Not only that, but extra pair into an availability code. Now, I don't recommend probably for a like a dev test, but for a production, definitely you want to have something that leverage that additional resiliency and so forth. Now, generally, uh, like you said, if there is underlying work being done, right? It the way this, say for example, availability set, they will make sure that they don't do those both the VMs at the same time, like a patching along that line, and expectation is less than 20 second should be if there is anything like a blip or something, but not more than that. But it's interesting to see if there are any specific scenarios along that line. um, right.
I mean, for some reason they don't like the failover. They can, I think, live with this 30-40 seconds that their
Yeah,
application is not
right.
available.
No,
So
fine. I think the best, that's why I put it into so relax the cluster network threshold. What happens by default, I think the default is 10 seconds for same subnet. I do recommend generally availability zone means it's within the same region. So uh, there are two. I'll tell you, we are writing a white paper being currently reviewed where we are thinking, should we do 40 seconds for IaaS kind of environment? Just the network threshold. Currently, documentation says 20, which tend to work, but we are contemplating it certain case. Now it depends, how and what you deploy and so forth. But uh, if you see issues, most likely you're gonna see even in the network threshold. um, Unless even I'm going to ask people here, if you run even virtualization platform on premises, you will tend to see most of the cluster failover, the availability group failovers tend to resolve around node losing network communication and so forth along that line. Rest other stuff, I think it's okay. I mean, uh, and so forth. I will like to proceed. Any last question on the what we described up until now? Okay. Actually, I'm going to ask this participant, anybody in this call knows why we need a load balancer? We don't need an on-premise environment. Why we need a load balancer in the Azure? And if it was needed up until, I would say, SQL 2019 CU8, you would need a load balancer if you want to do availability group in Azure. So why? A very common question asked, why things like load balancer, and actually tell you there is not, unless actually there's good thing documented in the blogs and so forth, not even from Microsoft, but in so forth. I'll tell you why, and it's very interesting. Okay. So the load balancer is needed for something called availability group listener. I hope all of you know what I'm talking about, listener. I wanted to talk about this. And I'm assuming some people are here maybe new, so let me just quickly walk through the setup of most availability group, or maybe share my screen and so forth. So generally in clustering, you will have nodes, right? So in this case, maybe I'll show you this one. I have 3 nodes, AG node 1, maybe too far. So node 1, node 2, node 3, I have a domain controller. All of these are in Azure. Okay, it's in North Central. I also have another one that's I think in a slightly different data center, 3 nodes. I'm not connected to the third node, but not RDP to it. I don't need to, but basically it's still there. So the setup I have, let me just show you one of the setup. So I have virtual machines here. Oh yeah, I don't want to save this. So I have this setup here. I have a 3 nodes and this domain controller here, right? And and AG node 1. Let me just zone it down here so that I think what's relevant stays relevant and so forth. Hope you can see it. Node 1, not central. Node 2, same basically data center. So it's a north central US. We call it region, right? The node 3 is meant for disaster recovery. So it's in a different region in Azure. Okay, they are part of the same availability group, the resource group, what we call not availability group, but resource group. Resource group is more like a container that houses all the Azure resources together, right? Just put it like a logical entity. Technically speaking, resource group is more logical entity, and so forth. So what happens basically? Yes, you will have a domain controller. Technically, you need a domain controller in each region where you have availability group set up. That's how it's supposed to be. So that even if and so forth. Secondly, uh, very important. I'm not sure some of you have tried or not. If you go here, each VM needs something called virtual network, which is just like a network that connects to the entire fabric of the cloud and so forth. We need something called peering. If you do a multi-subnet clustering, I'll just briefly walk through the setup of availability group. So the SQL side of things, I hope most of you being a SQL enthusiastic or data platform enthusiastic here on a very cold day in Chicago, Thursday evening. So I'm assuming all of you have some familiarity. If not, I apologize. I kind of expect you to know how AG is set up. But SQL side of things, same old, same old. You install a standalone SQL server and enable the always on feature using configuration manager and stuff like that. But the cloud stuff slightly different. You have to do something called VNet peering, so that the nodes into the cluster which are in different region can talk to each other. So that VNet, because they are in a different VNet, each region, each the resources within the each region would have its own network. So you have to kind of pair them so that they can communicate. So that is VNet peering is needed, which is slightly different than what you do. And then if I show you a setup here, my setup here, which is basically a failover cluster, I am using something very different. Which I'm using here is something called Cloud Witness. So all I have to do basically is I have a blob storage in the cloud, and then it connects to it, and that witness is participating. So yes, you do need the outbound internet. I think it talks on the port the 443 or something. So that's a secure HTTPS connection over to the blob storage and stuff like that. But slightly different setup as well. And yes, the VM is going to have one network and other things that I described. You can run a PowerShell command to relax the setting and so forth. I think if I still have the web page open, it actually shows you how you can do that, and you can run a get that cluster, find the property like same subnet and the cross subnet and set it up or increase it. See, changing the cluster threshold takes immediately, and you don't have to restart any resources and stuff like that. So all this documented stuff here, and I think you can also review some of the things, but I just want to briefly cover the setup and so forth. Now let's talk about load balancer, which is I think where we're going to spend some time here quickly. So load balancer is needed because when you have an on-premise, what happens? The listener creates a DNS record in the right for availability group listener creates a DNS record within the on-premise DNS servers and so forth, and actually gets bind to the primary replica's MAC address. This happens in the cloud, and what makes this happen is something called a protocol. It's called gratuitous address resolution protocol. Some people are familiar with ARP, address resolution protocol. Has slight variations we call gratuitous address resolution GARP. So GARP is not something because it requires something for the security reasons and other in the cloud environment. Most public clouds, I'm talking about AWS, GCP, and so forth, where they don't allow network broadcast in the cloud environment. So that technology that used to work on premises does not work. Means the DNS does not bind the IP resources of listener into the MAC addresses of the primary replica, stuff like that. That ARP does not come into picture. And in order to each public cloud providers they try to address that issue with their own variation because of this. And I'll try to simplify it. A lot of stuff here is very high. So I just want to say, basically, network broadcast is not supported in the cloud environment for security, and because it's a kind of shared fabric they have along that line. So we need to have a load balancer kind of, which kind of facility, and the load balancer is needed because you need to have availability group listener. Okay, if you don't need a listener, you don't need a load balancer, but listener is needed. That's how your client application can connect to the availability group resource and provide you a little bit more transparent failovers where you don't need to change connection string after failover and so forth. Okay, hopefully you are with me. I'll just briefly talk about that's the reason, because the the GARP or the network broadcast not supported. Now there are two types of load balancer. Okay, so what is load balancer? No, let me go back to basic my screen here. I'll find a load balancer. I'll show it to you. So if I go to this resource group, I would have something called, maybe I'm filtering it. Let's see if I can find it. It's called ILB kind of thing. So maybe I'm filtering it. Yeah, I will find the actual. So it's something called, maybe I have it here. I kept two open. Yeah. Okay. I'll keep just in case. So there is something called a load balancer needed. What is load balancer? I'll show you. It basically has some settings that need to be done. So I will spend some time on load balancer setup. I may have some slides here and there, but I just want to focus how this load. So load balancer is needed for listener. So in this setup here, for example, I have basically, and you can use one load balancer for multiple listeners and so forth. So my setup here, right? I have basically a load balancer that has a front end IP. Okay. And that IP here generally is your listener IP in the Windows clustering. All right, stay with me. I'll come to it more. I have multiple front end IPs because I have multiple listeners. Each listener would need, if you know the on-premises stuff, this when I say each listener will have its own IP, right? What I'm talking about here, let me just show you. In this case, I have two AGs, for example, right? Each AG has its basically, right, can have its own resources along that line. So I'm not, I think this one is black, but I think here, let me just stop to another availability group. The other one I have not set it up, just I want to show a demo maybe later on. But in this case, this is an availability group. Can you see my screen here? All okay? Jared following me? So this listener thing, right? This listener, that thing would map to a load balancer IP address. In each region, you have Azure virtual machine running. All right, little bit difficult. Stay with me here. So this basically this listener component, that's what you use for client connectivity, right? It would need this load balancer functionality to function, which I was showing you, sorry, wrong window, and so forth. So what happens in each Azure region, you have Azure virtual machine, a load balancer is needed. You put the virtual machine, in this case, I have two virtual machines, node 1 and node 2. You will put it in a backend pool. You create something called probe. A probe is like ping, if you know the ping, it's kind of pinging that listener IP, that kind of functionality. I'm speaking very loosely speaking language, but just allow me. This probe is basically, so if I go to AlwaysOn availability group endpoint port, my case listener will be, the probe will basically ping the listener IP and so forth. All of this is well documented into our product documentation, how to set up a listener, because without that, you don't have a listener setup. And then you set up something called load balancing rule and stuff like that. So this load balancer comes in a picture because the listener requirement and so forth. So that is what I will briefly just discuss the setup of it, but let me ask in participants in this, anybody here that have set up the listener in the Azure VM uh, and so forth? Anyone? Okay. All right. I'll turn up my video, but quite crowd. I hope I'm not bringing a very difficult topic and so forth, but let me just quickly walk you through this load balancer setup. Okay. Jared, doing a quick check. You guys, it's not, hopefully I'm still
No, you are doing good.
okay. All right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we
we
got
can
you
hear you.
here.
Okay. All right. I'm just want to make sure, do the best to explain load balancer. Okay, let's just quickly walk through. So basically load balancer, you go to Azure, you can create just like any other resource, you say load balancer. Okay. Happen. So if I go to load balancer, it will, I say new. Now I won't create one here. I wanted to, it will take some time and so forth. So basically load balancer, it has this setup. For SQL Server DBAs, I'll tell you, if they've been asked to deploy an availability group in Azure VM, this thing is where they get stuck on because it's been asked them to do it. Load balancer comes in, I have some time constraints, I'll quickly go through, okay? Comes in two flavors, basically. If you see here type, right? Internal and public. 99% you're gonna use internal. Public means in uh, externally exposed. Externally exposed means internet exposed on the public internet. You will never gonna have SQL Server exposed on the public internet. So the likelihood, I have not seen customer deploying a public load balancer. You don't need it. You only need internal. Internal means it can be only accessible within the virtual network in on which the VMs are residing. Okay, so internal load balancer. If you have web servers, right, IIS, which is exposed on the public internet, in that case, you will need a public load balancer, not for SQL Server. So it has to be generally, like as I say, internal load balancer. It comes in a two SKUs, standard and basic. Basic, I think it's a more like a free kind of load balancer and comes with, just like anything else, has limitations. So the basic version you can use as long as your availability group virtual machines not spanning multiple region. Okay, the cost is not significant for load balancer. It's actually very less. Okay, not anything close to a virtual machine running on SQL Server or anything like that. It's pretty less. So there is a price you can find between the standard and basic, but you want to do standard, and where in scenario where you do not only want high availability but disaster recovery. If you don't use, we have seen so many cases where what happens, support cases. I talk to Azure VM support group pretty much every day. So the very frequent topic is customer deploy a free the basic version of load balancer. And then they have this availability groups spanning the multiple Azure regions. What happens, the resources cannot talk to each other across that region. You can't be, can't connect to SQL and stuff. Like, I think it's a firewall issue. The listener cannot be connected from, in my case, I have resources in North Central, like two virtual machines that is giving me high availability, right? Synchronous replicas per se. And I have another replica that is in Azure East region and so forth. They won't be able to connect. So application cannot connect to listener on another region if you use basic. So if you want to do really and so forth, and unless you spend some time troubleshooting, you won't be able to figure it out and so forth. So standard load balancer. So I actually ended up making a slide where I can depict basically to make it easy for you where you want to do it. Something you say a basic load balancer supports VM that are only in availability set, but the standard first is the support. So availability zone is little better. So that standard provides it. Second thing is you need standard load balancer if you have VM spanning multiple region. I just state that. And then Third thing is, if you use standard load balancer, your VM needs standard IP addresses. That's where this, what happens, customer just deploy the VMs, which by default you gives you a basic IP address. And if you are not very careful, you won't be able to put those virtual machine on the backend pool of the load balancer if they don't use standard IP addresses and so forth. So there are some gotchas. The load balancer is very affordable. The cost is not significant. So I generally recommend use standard load balancer. Doesn't have any catch and so forth. So uh, and along that line, I want to do one brief talk about load balancer setup, which is basically there are two ports then people get confused about and so forth. So one is called the port, and then there's something called backend port. There's actually help available, but it's not very meaningful to the unless you have done many times. So the front end port is what's basically like client wins applications connects, which is mostly going to be 1433, which I have it. The backend port, you can keep it for the simplest deployment. You can keep a listener on the same port 1433. I do recommend it, right? But if you have a slightly uh, weird scenario or a different scenario, the backend port is basically the port listeners running on the SQL side. If you remember, when you configure a listener, even in the wizard or to T-SQL, you provide the port. So most customers tend to have, if they have default instance, keep the listeners on the same port as SQL Server. But if you decide to have a listener on a different port, you need to have that part on the backend pool and so forth. And then the last setup is to run a PowerShell script that basically ties. Keep in mind what this PowerShell script does. You have something called load balancer, right? That is different thing. And then you have something on the backends, which is we call it cluster. So how do we um, join them? By running this PowerShell. Now, all I described here very briefly due to time constraint, very well documented. If you go to always on, just putting typing on availability group in Azure, all these are actually in the documentation. Azure VM. Let me see if they can come up here. Hopefully they do. Uh, it says overview of Azure VMs, right? It actually describes this scenario, what need to be done, how to do it, deployment, consideration, and so forth. And then I think it will actually show you uh, uh, all this step by step. I think we also have some template now. You can use it if you use, I think, Enterprise Edition and something like that. But basically, we do have a step by step. You would have to do a load balancer if you need to do it and stuff like that. So if I just briefly, all documented. Unfortunately, this comes to the SQL Server DBAs who's doing it, and they are new to all this, like, and they find little bit overwhelming at the time. Like, what I'm dealing with is, they have done many listener setup and so forth, but something you want to do it. We also have, I think, if you look at here, configure connectivity. Now we provided a little bit more information. We have different type of listeners. So VNN listener, this is a traditional listener that all of you, if you go here, it actually says load balancer, which is traditional listener. Okay, but and so load balancing, cluster probe, test failover, test connect. But here you actually have that PowerShell script I was talking about. So you have to go through that tutorial. So that is now they actually even come up with a new name they call VNN, Virtual Network Name Listener, which is traditional listener, which requires load balancer. I'll stop here before I go to the next topic, which is DNN listener. You guys can see here, DNN listener. Any questions on load balancer? Okay. I'm gonna promise Jared I'll have something easy, but go ahead if anybody has any questions. Somebody was trying to speak.
Nope, no questions in the chat.
Okay. All right. So the the VNN listener is just like a traditional listener you have in the availability group. Now, what they have done, this load balancer, most customers, I'll skip this slide I discussed already, was a challenge. If they go to Azure, they do not want to, as I said, setting up a listener for administrators becoming a challenge. So we start seeing customer opening support cases needing help with, even though the documentation is actually, in my personal opinion, it is actually, if you follow it, you don't have any chance to of failing, but somehow still, there are sometimes permutations. Customer can do one listener and then they say, hey, how can we do the other one, and so forth. Yes, you can do as many listeners as you want. There's no such like a limit per se. So let me talk about this distributed network name. So what can we do so that, so the engineering group had a challenge coming. What can we do is this, get away with this whole load balancer. Most customers not familiar, they don't use an on-premise and stuff like that. So they actually creatively find out creatively. There's a Windows file servers. When you do the clustering of that, it used to use this distributed network name. So it's there in Windows Server 2016. Okay. And that's how they used to do. Just like we have a listener for availability groups. Some of you, those who are familiar with the failover clustering, the shared disk clustering, right? You need a shared, so now you can do in Azure as well. That basically required something called the SQL Server network name, right? And so forth. Similarly, the file servers needed something called distributed network name along that line. So they are actually incorporating the same functionality that you're using for file server. So they have to reprogram the SQL server slightly so that it understands this new thing. And that's why we call it a feature. So in SQL 2019, cumulative update 2, CU2, the shared disk failover cluster, I'll talk about it maybe one day if you have an interest. It's actually now much easier to do it in Azure as well. You can actually do a shared storage. If you have some requirement and you don't want to do availability groups, you want to do shared disk failover clusters, yes, you can do it. And so CU2 enabled the DNN support for failover clustered instance, the FCI. CU8 enabled actually support for, maybe I have another slide for it. Yes, here. And CU8 support for availability groups. So it's actually very recent. It does work. We look for cases and no cases. The two reasons: one, most customers not using it. Second is those who actually use it, we have not heard. So we'll tell you this: if you don't get cases, means it's working, or customer not using it. But right now, those, it's been out there, we have not got any cases. So it works actually much simple. I'm going to show you a demo. No load balancer, nothing. It works very simple. Everything built into cluster. You don't need anything else. Just run a PowerShell for now. We may add a support for the interface in the later, but right now all PowerShell and so forth. So we now have two kind of listeners for cloud environment. The VNN listener, that's just like a traditional listener you create and so forth. And this distributed network name, which is something new for the SQL 2019. Way it works is actually it binds to all the cluster nodes, right? The IP addresses of all the cluster nodes in a way. And we do recommend you enable multi-subnet failover. Even if you have maybe VMs running on the same region or same subnet, you do, because what it does, it actually tries all the IPs in parallel when you enable multi-subnet. So extremely fast detection of failover and so forth. So I put a slide together. Difference: the VNN listener is traditional listener. If you are on premise, that is just the listener. If you are in a cloud, if you have done some high availability solutions in the cloud, VNN listener is your friend. Okay. And so forth. Used to do it. That's how you can still do it in 2016, 2014, 2012. If you deploy availability groups in Azure virtual machines, VNN listener load balancer is required. You don't have a choice. For if you deploy SQL 2019, you have CU8, you use availability groups, you can do DNN listener and so forth, right? Very simple configurations, run a PowerShell script, done. Nothing else needed. Okay, so that's where we bring it up. I'll show you maybe quick demo of hope my demo code works and so forth. So maybe I'll show you demo, and the demo code is with me. So this is an availability group. If you see here, I have just set up an environment. There are actually 3 nodes into it: node 1, node 2, and node 3. The 2 are located in the same region. The node 3 is located in a different Azure region, for and so forth. Uh, I actually have 2 networks just for actually I didn't create it. The VMs created it, but actually it's behind the scene it's the same NIC. So if you look at the actual NIC, it should be just a 1 on the machine and so forth. Okay, just want to give you the perspective. So this right now I don't have the listener and so forth in the current setup. So if I want to do it, like for example, a DNN listener, all I need to do is run that sample PowerShell. We published this PowerShell on the documentation. So all you do is copy paste into a PowerShell and just run it. So if I just run this, basically it's gonna ask me 3 parameters. The 3 parameters I need is says what is your AG, what's you wanna name the name of the DNN, and what's the port the sequels the you're gonna use for this DNN and stuff like that. So you need just 3 parameters. You run the PowerShell and you are good to go and so forth. So you create a DNN listener, right? So let's just do it and then I'll show you. So no load balancer, nothing like that. So it says what's my AG name? I think my AG name here it's called AG Corp or yeah, I think it's an AG Corp, right? That's my AG. So I'm gonna just type it in here, AG Corp. I think the window may be slightly smaller for you, but DNS name, I say AG DNN, just put it anything, right? English name. And I can say my DNM, let's stay on 1433. Add a DNN listener. Yes. So it basically did everything offline, online, the resource. It does need to do it and so forth. My DNN is configured. So basically, this is my listener, new type of listener, no load balancer, everything in cluster and so forth. So I can use this to basically establish connectivity and so forth. Just different type of listener, which is basically, if you look at here, is bound to it and so forth. So and its dependencies and stuff like that. But my AG resource should have the, I think it should take care of everything. And the DNN, the actual availability group has a dependency on the DNN and stuff like that. So very transparent way to create a listener. And just have few, we have 6 minutes. I'll just quickly do FAQs. Yes, you do have to be on the latest version of SQL. I don't know they have planned to backport it. Expected failover time much quicker. See, when you do this load balancer required that I show you probing. So probing need to be timed out and stuff like that. But this one very quick. There's no probe, nothing. Probing means when you go to just to show you just a high level technology always those when it works actually it actually betterment. So when you set up this load balancer, if I can find my ILB, see if it comes up here. Load balancers. No, okay, I'll have to find one. AGILB. In one of this probe settings, it has that interval. So 5 seconds interval. 2 is the threshold, means it takes about 10 seconds for it to even detect fail that my resource is not available. So I would definitely so this makes it easy, much faster. And then a couple more FAQs. Does it support multi-subnet? Yes, absolutely. You can just even, we recommend you set up the multi-subnet failover to true. And any changes required in terms of for you to do it. I think there is not much additional consideration. Everything else should work, replications. The only thing I think it doesn't work currently is the distributed AG, this thing, because we have to make some code changes. And All APIs, modern APIs, as long as it supports multi-subnet, should work. If it doesn't support it, we'll have to try the IPs in serially. So some connectivity challenges, but I hope you don't have an application that doesn't support multi-subnet and stuff like that. So I'm gonna stop here, take questions. I know this is a loaded topic, probably, and some of you may not be familiar with the high availability in Azure virtual machine. So maybe next time, Jared, will have something more generic and an interesting thing to talk, something more simple if possible. But I'll ask any questions on the topic we discuss. That's
Yeah, it
my
looks like
first.
Frank had a question. He was saying, in this example where you created the DNN, do you have a VNN listener configured?
Okay, good question. So I do not have it for the one that I showed you as a demo, but they can both coexist, Frank. Okay.
So a follow-up question on that. So I've actually got a client and I'm configuring DNN listeners for them right now because they were having serious issues with their VNN listener, and they're coexisting at the current moment. And we've got to use the port number for the DNN because they both exist.
Yes.
If you, in this case, when you connect from an application, can you just connect directly to the DNN listener, or do you still need the port number?
So my understanding, if it is a different port, then yes, you do need, I think, the DNN comma port
Okay.
convention.
So
Right.
if it's 1433, you're good to go.
Yes, but if it is
Okay,
not
cool.
1433, you have to
Makes
specify.
sense.
Okay. But
All right,
yes,
great.
so if you have just a I think good point you bring it up, Frank, here. You can have both. So if you have an existing application, you can have both, like one AG uses DNN, other one uses VNN listener and stuff like that. But in my personal opinion, once you go to SQL 2019, the best thing you want to have is this, and so forth. Load balancer, I'll tell you, there are so many permutations that even the seasoned person, like, I have customers say, I know I have done 3-4, but I'm gonna do like two AGs and two listeners. What I'm going to do different? Like, should I do multiple load balancers? No, you don't do multiple load balancer, just one load balancer. You just need to set up a separate probe port because there is a possibility each AG resource may be on a different node and stuff like that. So I think technology sometimes improvement is in a good part and so forth. So along that line, but if there are any other questions, if not any other questions on SQL Server, I see if you have it. I like to learn what's new and exciting. If anybody has anything pressing, I think we are ending. So I'm ending my presentation. I'm stop sharing my screen. So let's just have anybody has any questions on anything on if I can answer.
I have one more quick question on the DNN, because I haven't used this yet, but it looks like you do not need a new IP address for it, which means even on-prem, this could be desirable when you get pushback from the network people, right? That are like, oh, why do you need so many IP addresses? Even though it's not like they're pulling money out of their pocket to create a new one, but some people don't like it. So this is IP-less, right?
Yes. You don't need an IP. Yes, it is basically just a name that gets registered. What it does, it binds to all the IP address behind the scene in the DNS, or all the IP addresses of the cluster nodes, right? And all them were tried in parallel. So you don't like the actual listener traditional VNN, you have to provide an IP address, right? Not in here. Even if I am multi-subnet, I didn't provide it. What it's gonna do, it's gonna bind to all the cluster IP addresses in DNS, right? And for me, nothing, it works transparently unless you use non-Windows DNS or something goofy, non-updatable DNS, probably some issues there and there. But I think, as I said, there are some customers, they basically are super excited trying this out and so forth, and we have not heard anything else. I talk to engineering group frequently. Today, I even talked for many other things. I told them DBCC shrink file, provide us an X event. There is no way, and they say yes, submit a DCR, design change request. So if you know shrink file, I mean, I was very vocal about it and say, hey, this thing is painful because why it is so difficult. Customer was looking at progress in shrink file, And unfortunately, there's a DM exact request or something. We show the percentage. It doesn't move for 3 days. I'm shrinking. Yeah. So what we do? Well, take a dump and we'll see if progressing. So I say, no, we need to do better. So I do provide some feedback, like example like that. But if you have something interesting to talk about, 5 more minutes and tell me and see what do you have and anything exciting you worked or any questions, any pressing issues you have seen, and see if I can answer. If not, I want to be grateful to Jared and Ross and Mina and a few of those who came here. I think I see a few familiar names as well. So I may know you or may have met you. So nice to all of you. Thank you for coming out as well and make this meeting happen and your interest for the in Microsoft Data Platform. So
yeah, and thank you for presenting.
Yep, no problem. What I will do, I'll share you the PowerPoint slide first thing tomorrow morning. I'll send it out to Ross, you, and then maybe you'll find a way to distribute to the rest of the group. But one last time, this is I'm not my group. Any question? Anybody's any question? Single question. I don't want to say any question because I'm not good talking everything, but SQL Server I can talk, but anything data platform even we can talk. Quiet group, knock on wood.
I think people are scared off tonight by the cold and the snow. I think some people are shoveling to get to tonight because yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm not in a luxury to talk, but there are a lot of good things coming and baking into the product. So if you are getting an echo, so Elliot, you're trying to speak something? Can't hear you.
I was just going to say thank you. It was very interesting.
Okay. All right. So,
All
Jared?
right.
Well, thank you. Thank you for speaking. Again, everybody, we're going to have next month, I will be speaking on Azure Synapse Analytics and the different kind of components of it in a workspace. Again, thanks, Chirag. And Ross, you can stop the recording, I think, because I don't think I can.
Yeah, I'll, here we go, stop recording.